The door to the Finch mansion burst open with a bang, and 16-year-old Olivia stormed in like a hurricane. It was 3 in the morning, and the silent fury on her face was a clear sign that the night had not ended well. She threw her leather jacket onto a velvet armchair, the gesture full of a teenage contempt for the luxury that surrounded her. The house, once a home, had become a stage for her rebellion since her mother's death a year earlier. Every object, every hallway, was a silent witness to her pain, a pain she transformed into shouts, slammed doors, and a fierce determination to push away anyone who dared to get close. From the top of the stairs, her father, Alistair Finch, watched her. He didn't come down. He just stood there, a silhouette in the dim light, his face a mask of bitterness and exhaustion. He was a man accustomed to being in command, to solving problems with the same coldness with which he closed multi-million-dollar deals. But his daughter was an enigma. He couldn't decipher, an equation for which his business logic had no answer. Grief had hardened him, turning his pain into a cruel impatience. He no longer saw the girl he loved, but a problem, a rebellion that needed to be contained, managed, silenced. For Alistair, Olivia's rebellion was a desecration of his late wife's memory. Stella had been the personification of grace and kindness, the light that balanced his own harshness, and now their daughter, in whom he looked and expected to see a reflection of Stella, was her opposite, angry, cynical, and self-destructive. The mansion had become a mausoleum for his perfect wife, each portrait of her on the walls a reminder of what he had lost and what his daughter, in his view, refused to honor. He loved her, but his love was buried under layers of grief and a profound disappointment. The search for a new nanny, or rather a new guardian, as the agency liked to call it, had become a depressing cycle of failures. Young psychologists, strict governesses, tutors with impeccable resumes, all had been devoured and spat out by Olivia's fury. That morning, Alistair leafed through another list of candidates, cynicism heavy on his shoulders. He was no longer looking for someone who could connect with his daughter. He was looking for someone who could, at the very least, survive her, someone who could be a wall, a presence to absorb the chaos so that he could continue to take refuge in his work. It was then that the agency director called him personally. "Alistair, I have a special candidate," she said, her voice full of a confidence he hadn't heard in a long time. Her name is Abigail, older, with impeccable references from the most difficult cases in Boston. Her specialty is resilience. The description was intriguing. They didn't promise miracles, didn't talk about innovative techniques. They spoke of a simple, powerful quality that was exactly what was missing in that house. Skeptical, but with no other options, Alistair agreed to interview her that same afternoon, expecting only another inevitable disappointment. Abigail's arrival was different. She didn't enter with the nervous energy of the younger candidates, nor with the authoritarian stiffness of the older ones. There was a deep calm about her, a serenity that seemed immune to the heavy atmosphere of the mansion. Her face was a map of a life lived, with expression lines that spoke not of harshness, but of a deep sadness that had been transformed into wisdom. Her gaze, as it landed on the portraits of Stella, held a familiarity and a pain that Alistair, for a moment, couldn't interpret, but that left him strangely unsettled. Olivia was summoned to the office, a ritual she knew all too well. She entered with her usual armor of sarcasm and indifference, ready to annihilate the newcomer with a few words. She scanned Abigail with a look of contempt from head to toe. "So you're the next one?" the teenager said, her voice a drawl. "I'd save you the trouble of unpacking. It'll save you time." The attack was direct, the first volley in a war she always won before it even began. It was her standard test, designed to destabilize and establish her dominance from the very first second. However, Abigail's reaction completely disarmed her. The older woman was not offended, did not try to defend herself, nor did she force a conciliatory smile. She simply watched her, not with the pity or anger Olivia was used to provoking, but with a look of deep, almost painful understanding, as if she could see right through the girl's armor. Anger is a very heavy armor for such a young girl to carry alone, Olivia, Abigail said, her voice soft but firm, without a hint of judgment. The sentence wasn't advice, it was a recognition. Olivia fell silent. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she was completely speechless. That gaze, that sentence, had pierced a layer of her defense she didn't even know existed. Alistair, watching everything, from his chair, felt a shiver. The other nannies had tried to fight Olivia's anger. This woman had embraced it. A mystery had just settled into his home. Who was this woman? And where did this almost supernatural ability to see the pain hiding behind his daughter's fury come from? The battle for Olivia's soul, he realized, had just become interesting. A mysterious nanny with a deep understanding of pain. A rebellious teenager left speechless for the first time. What is Abigail's secret? Subscribe to the channel, leave a like to unravel this mystery, and send a message of strength to young Olivia, who carries such a heavy burden on her shoulders. Intrigued and, for the first time in a long time, feeling a spark of hope, Alistair hired her on the spot. The decision was impulsive, a deviation from his usually calculated behavior. Olivia, bewildered at being so easily disarmed, stormed out of the office and slammed the door, leaving behind a tension full of possibilities. As Alistair showed Abigail around the mansion, he talked about the house rules, about schedules, about his daughter's difficulties. But Abigail barely heard the words. Her eyes absorbed every detail, not like an employee, but like an archaeologist discovering the ruins of a lost civilization, the life her own daughter had built far away from her. The tour of the house ended in front of a large oil portrait that dominated the living room. It was Stella, Alistair's late wife. The painting captured her in a moment of pure joy, her smile luminous, her eyes full of a kindness that seemed almost ethereal. "This was my Stella," Alistair said, his voice laden with a painful reverence. Olivia was just like her before everything. He spoke of her like a saint, a perfect creature whose loss had left an impossible void to fill, not realizing that for the woman beside him, that image was so much more than that of a lost wife. For Abigail, facing that portrait was like a punch to the chest that left her breathless. There was the face of the baby she had held for only a few weeks, now a woman she had never known. She saw her own eyes in the shape of hers, her father's smile on her daughter's lips. An overwhelming wave of emotions, pain, pride, regret, and a love that had spanned decades of silence hit her. She had to grip the arms of her chair tightly to keep from collapsing. It took all of her strength, all of a lifetime's discipline, to maintain her composure, to hide the earthquake happening in her soul. The memory transported her back 40 years. A young Abigail, 19 years old, alone in a hospital room, holding her newborn daughter. The child's father had disappeared upon learning of the pregnancy, and she, with no family and not a penny to her name, knew she couldn't give that little girl the life she deserved. The decision to give her up for adoption was the most painful and most selfless act of her life. She gave her to a loving, wealthy couple with the sole condition that she would never know who she was. It was the ultimate sacrifice, an act of love that would condemn her to a lifetime of longing. The years that followed were a long journey of rebuilding. Abigail found her calling in caring for other people's children. She became an exceptional nanny, a legendary figure among the wealthy families of Boston, known for her patience and her ability to handle the most difficult cases. But in every child she cared for, she searched for her. Stella's eyes. She never tried to find her, never broke the promise she had made. She just loved her daughter from a distance, imagining her happy, safe, and living the life she had dreamed for her. A dream she now knew had come true, but with a tragic end. The news of Stella's death reached her by chance. In an obituary in the society section of a newspaper one of her employers had left on a table. The name Stella Finch made her stop. The photo accompanying the notice confirmed her worst fear. Abigail's world collapsed for a second time. The daughter she had only known in dreams was dead. The grief she had carried in silence for 40 years exploded with the force of a recent wound. She cried for days, not for the woman she didn't know, but for the baby girl she never got to see grow up, for the chance of one day meeting, now lost forever. The same newspaper notice mentioned the devastated husband, Alistair Finch, and the couple's troubled teenage daughter, Olivia. The word struck her. A granddaughter. She had a granddaughter, a living piece of her Stella, a girl who was now suffering, lost in the same grief that was consuming her. In that moment, a new purpose was born from the ashes of her pain. The promise to stay away had been made to protect Stella's happiness. Now that Stella was gone, a new promise formed. She would protect her daughter's daughter at any cost. It was not chance that led her to the Finch mansion. It was a meticulously executed plan. Abigail used her impeccable reputation and her network of contacts to ensure her resume reached the specific agency that Alistair used. She knew about Olivia's reputation, about the succession of failed nannies. She knew she was the only one qualified for that job, not because of her techniques, but because of her secret. Her arrival was not an act of professionalism. It was an act of infiltration, a grandmother's secret mission to save the only family she had left in the world, even if that family could never know who she really was. Back in the present, in her new room in the mansion, Abigail watched the solitary figure of Olivia in the garden from her window. The girl was kicking at stones with an anger that Abigail knew well, the same anger she had felt for years. Her mission was clear. She wasn't there to be an employee, to impose rules, or to please her boss. She was there to wage a silent battle for her granddaughter's soul. She had to break through the girl's armor of anger and show her that even after the greatest of losses, it was still possible to find love and a way back to the light. Abigail's first day at the Finch mansion didn't begin with the imposition of rules, but with an act of silent observation. She moved through the rooms, not like a governess ready to give orders, but like a scholar of grief. She noticed how the household staff walked on tiptoes, as if afraid to wake the sadness that slept in every corner. She saw the portraits of Stella, always clean and prominently displayed, like altars to a saint. And above all, she observed Olivia, realizing that the girl's rebellion was an armor, and that every act of defiance was a disguised cry for help. Olivia, for her part, began her campaign of attrition. She started with sound. Locked in her room, she blasted loud, aggressive music at maximum volume, making the mansion's walls tremble. It was her initial test, her way of polluting the environment, of marking her territory with chaos and noise, hoping the new nanny would come with screams and threats, which would give her the ammunition she needed for a confrontation. The household staff held their breath, waiting for the explosion that, with the others, always came. Instead of screams, there were soft knocks on the door. Abigail didn't ask her to lower the volume. When Olivia opened the door, ready for a fight, the older woman just looked at her calmly. "That's powerful music," she said, her serene voice rising above the furious drumming. "The anger in it feels very honest." The reaction was so unexpected, it left Olivia speechless. Abigail hadn't criticized her taste or her behavior. She had validated her feeling. By acknowledging the anger in the music, she acknowledged the anger in the girl, and that was something no one had ever done before. The teenager, confused by the lack of conflict, moved on to other tactics. Slammed doors, monosyllabic answers, a studied contempt during meals. Each act was an invitation to a fight, bait for Abigail to lose her patience and show her true colors. But the nanny never took the bait. For every slammed door, she would just say, "I hope you feel better." To every sarcastic comment, she would respond with a genuine question that dismantled the irony. She wasn't playing Olivia's game. She was calmly changing the rules of the board. Alistair watched this strange Cold War from a distance, completely perplexed. He, who resolved conflicts with dismissals and direct orders, didn't understand Abigail's strategy. There were no shouts, no punishments, no explosive tension that had become the norm in his house. There was only a persistent calm on the nanny's part, who seemed to absorb Olivia's fury like a sponge. He didn't know if it was genius or weakness, but he couldn't deny one fact. For the first time in a year, the mansion was not a battlefield, but a psychological chessboard. The conflict inevitably moved to the epicenter of the family's pain. Stella's old art studio, on the top floor. The room had remained untouched since her death, a dusty sanctuary of unfinished canvases and the smell of oil paint. Olivia found Abigail there, standing in the middle of the room, just looking out the window. "What are you doing in here?" the girl snarled, her voice full of a possessive fury. "This was my mother's place. No one has the right to be in here. Get out now!" The pain in her voice was palpable. That room was her last intact link to her mother. Abigail turned, slowly, her eyes full of a sadness that mirrored Olivia's. "I know, dear, and it's a beautiful place, full of her soul," she said softly. "I didn't come to invade. I just came to miss her with you." The response, once again, broke through the teenager's defenses. She had expected an excuse, a justification, a hasty retreat. Instead, she received an offer of companionship in her grief. Abigail wasn't trying to take Stella's place. She was offering to share the weight of her absence, a weight Olivia had been carrying alone for a very long time. Feeling that she was losing the war, Olivia retreated to a new trench: apathy. She stopped showing up for meals, claiming she wasn't hungry. She began to neglect her online studies, failing to turn in assignments and attend classes. It was a form of silent self-destruction, a passive-aggressive cry for help. If they couldn't drive the new nanny out with anger, perhaps they could do it with worry, by showing her father that the new presence was harming her, that she was withering away. It was a dangerous tactic, born of the purest desperation of a wounded teenager. Abigail, noticing the new strategy, didn't resort to lectures or forced meals. Instead, she made a subtle and unexpected move. She spent an entire afternoon in Stella's studio. She didn't move anything. She just carefully dusted each paintbrush, organized the dried tubes of paint, and cleaned the stained color palette. It was an act of reverence, a silent care for the memory of the woman she could never call her daughter. The studio, once a dusty tomb, once again looked like a place of creation, a living space. At the end of the afternoon, she left the studio door open. On the main easel, which had been empty, she placed a single blank canvas. It was her only act of change, a blank canvas in the middle of a sanctuary of memories. It was a silent invitation, a blank page offered to a girl whose story seemed to have stalled. She didn't say a word to Olivia about what she had done. She didn't invite her to paint. She just created the opportunity, and with her quiet wisdom she waited, knowing that an artist's curiosity is always stronger than her pain. That night, late at night, Olivia left her room. Believing everyone was asleep, she went up the stairs to the studio. The open door was an invitation she couldn't refuse. She entered and stood there for a long time, surrounded by her mother's unfinished works, the familiar smell of paint and turpentine filling. The air, a breath of a happy past. The blank canvas on the easel seemed to look at her, challenging her to create, to continue the story her mother had started. From a dark corner of the hallway, Abigail watched, her heart tight with anticipation. She saw Olivia approach the easel. She saw the girl's hand tremble as she touched one of her mother's paintbrushes. And then the silent miracle happened. With a hesitant, almost reverent movement, Olivia dipped the brush in blue paint and made the first small mark on the blank canvas. It wasn't a masterpiece, it wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. It was the first time in a year that Olivia wasn't destroying something, but creating. The first crack in the armor of ice. The weeks that followed were, for Alistair, an exercise in espionage in his own home. He maintained his routine of leaving early and arriving late, but his mind was no longer on business. It was there, in the mansion, imagining the silent chess match between his daughter and the new nanny. The most disturbing part was the lack of news. The phone didn't ring. There were no calls from the housekeeper, no desperate messages from an employee on the verge of a breakdown. The chaos, which had become the soundtrack of his domestic life, had been replaced by a disconcerting calm, a silence that made him more anxious than any scream. He started finding pretexts to come home earlier, inventing cancelled meetings. He would enter the house without making a sound, moving through the hallways like an intruder, trying to catch the secret behind that miracle. But there were no secrets, just small scenes of a normality he had forgotten existed. He would see Olivia sitting at the kitchen table, doing her homework while Abigail prepared a snack, the two of them in a comfortable silence. He would overhear snippets of civilized conversations, devoid of the acidity and sarcasm that were once his daughter's only language. One day, he witnessed an interaction that left him perplexed. Olivia came down the stairs, furious about a bad grade at school. She was ready to explode, to blame the world, to take out her frustration on whoever was closest. Abigail, who was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, didn't try to calm her down. She just said, "Disappointment is a harsh teacher, but it teaches lessons that victory never can." The sentence, spoken with an unshakable calm, gave Olivia no target for her anger. The girl stopped, her fury dissipating, replaced by a thoughtful confusion. Abigail didn't fight the fire, she let it extinguish itself for lack of oxygen. Alistair began to realize that Abigail wasn't fixing his daughter. She was giving her tools for self-knowledge, for resilience. She didn't treat her like a problem teenager, but like an intelligent young woman who was using the wrong weapons to fight her pain. This subtle, respectful approach was something he, with his impatience and his pragmatic vision, would never have conceived. He had always wanted a quick fix, a cure. She offered a slow process, a journey of healing that required patience and, above all, a deep faith in Olivia's ability to find herself. The most revealing moment happened on a rainy afternoon. Alistair found the two of them in the library, a room Olivia avoided because it had been her mother's favorite. They were sitting on the floor, surrounded by old photo albums. He braced himself for the worst, for an avalanche of tears and painful memories. But what he heard was his daughter's voice, soft and curious, and the sound of a low laugh. Abigail wasn't focusing on the loss. She was celebrating the life. She would point to the photos and ask questions that Alistair had never thought to ask. "Your mother seemed to have an incredible sense of humor. What's the story behind this ridiculous hat?" Abigail asked, pointing to a photo of Stella at a costume party. Olivia smiled, a genuine, nostalgic smile. "She wore it to a Mardi Gras party. Dad hated it, said it was tacky, but she didn't care. She loved being tacky." For the first time, Olivia spoke of her mother in the present tense of her memories, not the past tense of her absence. She was rescuing the person, not just mourning the loss. Alistair felt a lump in his throat. He realized that in his own pain, he had turned Stella into an untouchable saint, a sacred and heavy memory. He had silently forbidden the memory of her to be light, fun, human. By embalming his wife's memory, he had stolen from his daughter the right to remember her mother with joy. Abigail, this stranger, was giving Olivia back the colors and laughter of her mother, while he could only offer her the black and white of grief. The realization hit him with the force of a painful epiphany. Inspired by that moment that evening, he attempted his own approach. He found Olivia in her room, listening to calmer music. Instead of saying goodnight and closing the door, he hesitated. "That music. Your mother loved this singer," he said, his voice a little clumsy. Olivia took off her headphones, surprised. "I know," she replied, without her usual hostility. "Sometimes I listen to feel closer to her." It wasn't a long conversation, but it was the first bridge built over the abyss between them in over a year. And the architect of that bridge was Abigail. A wave of gratitude for this woman washed over him, a gratitude so deep it was almost suffocating. She had achieved in a few weeks what he, the father, had failed to achieve in an entire year. She had begun the process of bringing his daughter back, but the gratitude was mixed with a curiosity that had now become a necessity. Her competence was so absolute, her insight into Olivia's soul so precise, that it couldn't just be professional skill. There had to be something more, a secret source for that wisdom. He needed to understand. Her calm in the face of fury, her wisdom in the face of pain. It wasn't the behavior of a simple nanny, no matter how experienced. It was the behavior of someone who knew that pain intimately, of someone who had already walked that same dark path. Sitting in his office that night, the question that had haunted him since the interview returned with overwhelming force. "Who are you, Abigail? Where did you really come from?" He knew he could no longer live with the doubt. He picked up the phone and called the best private investigator in the city, a discreet man who solved problems for the elite. "I need a full report," Alistair said, his voice low, "on my daughter's new nanny, Abigail. I want to know everything, where she was born, where she studied, where she worked. And most importantly, I want to know what happened in the last few years of her life. Leave no stone unturned." He hung up the phone, feeling at once like a traitor for invading the privacy of the woman who was saving his family and a desperate father who needed a truth. The next day, he observed Abigail. With new eyes, every gesture of affection she showed Olivia, every word of wisdom, now seemed to contain a hidden message, a clue to a past he didn't know. He became a detective in his own home, searching for answers he might not be prepared to find. The question was no longer whether Abigail was good for his daughter. The question now was much deeper. Why was she the only person in the world who seemed to be able to understand her so perfectly? What connected them? Abigail's secret has been revealed, a truth so painful and profound, it changes everything. Alistair now knows who she is. Subscribe to the channel to see how he will handle this revelation and comment, "What is the biggest family secret you have ever discovered or heard about?" The days that followed were torture for Alistair. He lived a double life. During the day, he witnessed the small miracles of Olivia's transformation, the laughter returning to the hallways, the hostility giving way to a cautious curiosity. At night, he would lock himself in his office, anxiously awaiting a call from the investigator, feeling like a hypocrite for spying on the life of the woman who was, undeniably, saving his daughter. The hope that was blooming in his house battled with the suspicion he himself had planted in his mind, a conflict that left him exhausted and irritable. The first call from the investigator came at the end of the week, but it didn't bring the answers Alistair expected. "Mr. Finch, I found something. Before becoming a nanny, Abigail was a literature teacher for over 20 years at one of the most prestigious colleges in the city. The information, instead of clarifying, only deepened the mystery. Why would such a respected teacher with a consolidated career abandon everything to take care of other people's children? It didn't make sense. The image of the humble nanny began to crack, giving way to the profile of a woman with a much more complex story than he had imagined. That same evening, he saw with his own eyes a glimpse of that past life. He found Abigail in the library, helping Olivia with a school essay on a classic poem. The passion with which Abigail spoke of the metaphors, the depth with which she interpreted each verse, was contagious. She wasn't just helping with homework, she was opening up a universe for her granddaughter. Alistair watched her, fascinated. He saw the teacher in action, the intellectual, the cultured woman hiding behind the facade of a simple, quiet nanny. His curiosity transformed into a genuine admiration for her mind. He began to understand that her calm was not passivity, but a controlled strength. The simplicity in her behavior was not a lack of sophistication, but a choice. She was a woman who, for some unknown reason, had decided to withdraw from the intellectual world she clearly dominated, to dedicate herself to a life of silent service. With each passing day, Alistair felt more intrigued, and at the same time, more ashamed of his investigation. He felt he was violating the privacy of a person who deserved only respect, but the need to understand was stronger than the guilt. The second call from the investigator came on a Friday night. The man's voice on the other end of the line was different, more hesitant, graver. "Mr. Finch, what I discovered is extremely personal. It's a matter of immense delicacy." The investigator's tone prepared Alistair for the worst. He felt a chill down his spine, a premonition that the truth he so desperately sought was about to surface, and that perhaps he wasn't prepared to hear it. His heart hammered in his chest as he waited for the revelation that would change everything. 40 years ago, the investigator continued, when she was just 19, Abigail had a daughter. Single from a poor family and with no resources, she made the decision to give the baby up for a closed adoption, believing it would give the child a chance at a better life. The revelation was already a shock, an explanation for the deep sadness he sometimes saw in her eyes. It was the pain of a mother who had made the greatest of sacrifices. But the story didn't end there. The real bomb was yet to come, and Alistair had no idea of its magnitude. The investigator paused, as if taking a breath for the last and most devastating part of the story. "I gained access to the adoption records from that time. I checked the names, the hospital, the date of birth." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Mr. Finch, the child she gave up, Abigail's biological daughter, was your late wife, Stella." The phone slipped from Alistair's hand, clattering onto the desk. The world stopped spinning. The walls of his office seemed to dissolve, and the only sound he could hear was that of his own runaway heart. The revelation fell upon him like an avalanche, recontextualizing every moment he had spent with Abigail. Her gaze upon Stella's portrait was not that of a stranger, it was that of a mother, looking at the daughter she could never hold. Her immediate understanding of Olivia's pain wasn't professional empathy. It was a grandmother's grief for the granddaughter she had just found. The infinite patience, the selfless dedication. It all made sense now. She wasn't just doing a job, she was on a sacred, silent mission, trying to heal the lineage she herself had begun and broken. A wave of shame, so intense it made him physically ill, washed over him. He had judged her. He had suspected her, tested her patience, invaded her privacy in the most sordid way possible, while she, in silence, was performing the noblest of loving acts. He had been watching from the shadows, looking for flaws, for ulterior motives. The baseness of his own behavior, in contrast to the nobility of her sacrifice, crushed him. He had acted like a small man in the presence of a giant. He stood up and went to the window. Down below, in the garden, the light from the living room illuminated a scene. Abigail was sitting, and Olivia beside her was combing the grey hair of the grandmother she didn't know she had. The tenderness of the gesture, the peace that emanated from the scene, was the final, irrefutable proof. He no longer saw a nanny and a teenager. He saw the missing link of a chain, two ends of the same story of pain and love, finally reconnecting. He was witnessing the silent healing of 3 generations of women in his family. Alistair's feelings for Abigail, which had been a confusing mix of gratitude and attraction, crystallized into something new and much more powerful, a profound reverence. He no longer saw a woman to conquer or a mystery to solve. He saw a heroine, a figure of almost mythical strength, who had borne the weight of a life of loss with a grace that humbled him. An overwhelming desire to protect her, to honor her sacrifice, to be worthy of her presence in his house, took hold of him. He knew with a certainty that shook him to his soul that this woman was the most extraordinary person he had ever met. The revelation of her secret didn't make her dangerous, it made her sacred. The seed of the turning point, planted by curiosity, had blossomed in his heart, not as a passion, but as a devotion. He understood that his life, from that moment on, would have a new purpose: to ensure that the woman who had given life to his beloved Stella, and who was now giving life back to his daughter Olivia, would never again feel alone or unprotected in the world. The morning after the revelation, Alistair was a transformed man. The knowledge of Abigail's past hadn't scared him. On the contrary, it had given him a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The weight of suspicion was replaced by the weight of a sacred truth, and he knew he had to honor it. He greeted Abigail at the breakfast table, not as a boss, but with a reverence and warmth that left her visibly perplexed. There was a new softness in his gaze, a kindness she was not used to seeing, which made her both grateful and uneasy. His attitude toward Olivia also changed drastically. Impatience gave way to curiosity. Instead of criticizing her neglect of her studies, he sat beside her and asked about her favorite subject. He praised the first stroke of paint she had left on the blank canvas in the studio, calling it a beautiful beginning. Olivia, suspicious by nature, didn't understand the sudden change. Her father's kindness was such unfamiliar territory that she didn't know how to navigate it, but a small, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in her wounded heart. Abigail observed this new dynamic with a mixture of joy and apprehension. She was happy to see father and daughter taking the first steps to rebuild their bridge. But the way Alistair looked at her was unsettling. His gaze was no longer that of a satisfied employer. It was laden with an emotion she couldn't decipher, a mixture of gratitude, sadness, and something deeper, almost a devotion. She felt that he had discovered something, that the secret she guarded so closely was, somehow, being perceived by him, and that both terrified and comforted her. Determined to honor Abigail's sacrifice, Alistair began to subtly create opportunities for her to connect with the memory of the daughter she never knew. During dinner, he started telling stories about Stella, anecdotes from her childhood, her quirks, her passions. He would address the stories to Olivia, but his eyes would always seek Abigail's reaction, secretly, offering her the pieces of her daughter's life that had been stolen from her. It was his silent way of giving her a gift, of sharing with her the treasure of his memories. One day, he came home with a huge bouquet of gardenias. The house needed a little life, he said as an excuse, but Abigail knew from one of Alistair's stories that those were Stella's favorite flowers. She accepted the bouquet, her hands trembling, the scent of the flowers filling her lungs like a breath from a past she could only imagine. It was a coded message, an act of gratitude and complicity that only the two of them understood, a shared secret that now united them in a new and dangerous way. Alistair's final act came over the weekend. He came down from the attic carrying an old wooden trunk covered in dust. "I thought it was time we opened this," he said to Olivia, his voice soft. "Your mother kept all her memories in here. Maybe Abigail can help you organize it." He placed the trunk in the center of the room and opened it. It was a time capsule, a treasure trove of an interrupted life, and he was inviting the two most important women in that story to explore it together, knowing that the truth, one way or another, was about to come to light. Olivia and Abigail sat on the floor beside the trunk. For the teenager, it was a chance to reconnect with her mother. For Abigail, it was torture and a blessing. With trembling hands, she touched the objects that had belonged to her daughter. School. Yearbooks, childhood drawings, a first baby shoe. Each object was a stab of pain for what she had lost, but also a caress of joy for finally being able to touch the traces of the life her sacrifice had provided. She struggled to hold back her tears, to maintain her mask of a serene nanny. Among the objects, Olivia found a small leather-bound diary with a key tied to a ribbon. It was her mother's journal from when she was 15. With a mixture of reverence and curiosity, she opened it. The pages were filled with Stella's elegant handwriting, telling of her teenage crushes, her fights with her parents, her dreams for the future. It was a portal to her mother's soul, showing her a version that wasn't the perfect, idealized figure, but a real girl, full of flaws and life. She began to read a passage aloud, her voice a little shaky. Stella wrote about feeling different, about the immense gratitude she had for her parents, who had adopted her and given her everything. And then, she wrote about the curiosity she felt about her other mother, the brave young woman who gave her up so she could have a better life. She wondered what this woman was like, if she resembled her, if they would ever meet. Olivia's voice faltered, the revelation that her mother was also adopted hitting her full force. The passage continued. Stella wrote that her adoptive parents gave her the only piece of information they had about her birth mother, a physical detail so that, perhaps, one day, fate would unite them. Olivia read the words aloud, her voice now a shocked whisper. They told me she had only one mark, a small, crescent-shaped birthmark on her left wrist. She stopped reading, the diary trembling in her hands. Her eyes, wide and full of a sudden, terrifying understanding, slowly lifted. She had seen that mark hundreds of times, helping Abigail with a plate, handing her a book, watching her maneuver her chair. Olivia's gaze fixed, as if in slow motion, on Abigail's left wrist, which was resting on the arm of her wheelchair, and there it was, unmistakable, a small, delicate, crescent-shaped birthmark. The world stopped. Time froze. The air in the room became thin, impossible to breathe. The truth, hidden for 40 years, was now exposed under the afternoon light. Abigail had also frozen. She didn't know about the diary, about that piece of information. The blood drained from her face. She followed Olivia's gaze to her own wrist and understood. The secret she had carried, like across her entire life, the identity she had promised never to reveal, had just been discovered. The granddaughter's eyes met the grandmother's, and in that gaze, a lifetime of questions, of pain, of sacrifice, and of love converged in a silent explosion that broke both their hearts and, at the same time, began to mend them. Alistair, watching everything from the doorway, felt tears stream down his face. He had planned to reveal the truth in his own time, in his own way. But fate, through the voice of his beloved Stella, had been faster, more poetic, and infinitely more powerful. He witnessed the exact moment when the past and present collided, the moment his daughter discovered not only that her mother was adopted, but that the woman who was teaching her to live again was, in fact, the origin of it all. The revelation was complete. The silence that followed the revelation was more deafening than any scream. Olivia let the diary fall to the floor, her eyes fixed on Abigail, trying to process a truth that was too big for her 16-year-old mind. "Is it you?" she whispered, her voice a thread. "Was it you all along?" Her eyes then darted to her father, who had entered the room, drawn by the sudden silence. "Did you know?" she accused, the pain on her face twisting into a wild fury. "Did you both lie to me?" The sense of betrayal was double, a conspiracy of silences that made her feel like a fool, a piece in their game. The armor of anger, which Abigail had worked so hard to dismantle, returned with a vengeance. "So it was all a lie?" Olivia shouted, the tears finally exploding. "All that patience, all that understanding. You weren't helping me, you were infiltrating, using my pain to get closer to the daughter you abandoned." Each word was a blow, a cruel twisting of the truth. For Olivia, Abigail's act of love was rewritten in that instant as the most selfish of manipulations. She didn't feel found, she felt invaded, her grief used as a gateway. She turned to her father, her fury now directed at him. "And you allowed it. You put a stranger in our house, knowing this absurd secret. You treated me like a child, a project to be fixed." She backed away, looking at them both as if they were monsters. I hate you both." With a cry of pure anguish, she ran out of the room, up the stairs, and slammed her bedroom door with a force that shook the entire house. The sound of the lock turning was the final declaration of war. She hadn't just locked herself in, she had exiled herself from them. The room was left in a devastated silence, the trunk of memories now looking like a Pandora's box that had been opened, releasing all evils. Abigail was paralyzed, her face pale, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Her worst fear had come true. The truth hadn't set anyone free, it had destroyed the fragile bond she had spent months building. She had lost her daughter once to fate, and now she felt she had lost her granddaughter to her own history. The pain of regret and loss was so overwhelming she could barely breathe. It was Alistair who moved first. He approached Abigail, his own face marked by pain. He knelt beside her chair, a gesture that abolished any remnant of hierarchy between them. "Abigail, look at me," he pleaded, his voice soft. "I'm so sorry. I found out a few days ago. I was waiting for the right moment, but there's never a right moment for a truth like this." His confession was a plea for forgiveness, an acknowledgement of his own cowardice in not preparing the ground, in not protecting them both from the explosion. He took her trembling hand. "She doesn't hate you," he said, using the same perceptive wisdom he had learned from her. "She's scared, and she's grieving again. She didn't just lose her mother. Today, she feels like she lost the entire story of her life. Her anger isn't about you. It's about the chaos the truth brought." In that moment, the roles were reversed. He was no longer the boss, but the comforter. He was the anchor in the middle of the storm that he himself, with his investigation, had helped create, and he felt an immense responsibility to guide them to safety. The alliance between them was solidified in that moment of shared crisis. There were no more secrets. They were just a man and a woman united by their love for two other women, one dead, one wounded, and by the monumental task of rebuilding a family from the rubble of a 40-year-old truth. "Give her time," he whispered. "Olivia is stronger than she thinks. She's like her mother and like her grandmother." The last sentence was a recognition, a final acceptance of the new lineage of that family. Meanwhile, locked in her room, Olivia was in her own hurricane. Anger consumed her, but beneath it, there was a current of confusing emotions. She picked up her mother's diary, which she had dropped on the floor, and began to read again. But this time, she didn't read as a betrayed daughter, but as a detective searching for clues. She looked for her mother's anger, for a sign that Stella had also felt deceived by the story of her adoption. But she found nothing. Instead of anger, her mother's words overflowed with gratitude and a tender curiosity. Stella wrote about the unconditional love of her adoptive parents, but also about the compassion she felt for the brave young mother who had given her up. "I don't feel abandoned," Stella had written in one passage. "I feel like I received two kinds of love, the love that gave me life and the love that taught me how to live it." Her mother's words, so mature and full of grace, were a balm and a challenge to her own anger. Stella didn't see the story as a betrayal, but as a complex gift. Olivia began to wonder if she was looking at everything the wrong way. In the days that followed, the mansion operated in a tense silence. Olivia refused to leave her room, except to pick up the trays of food that Abigail left, silently at her door. She never saw her grandmother. She only felt her constant, patient presence. Abigail didn't force contact. She gave Olivia what the girl needed most: space. Space to be angry, to cry, to reread the diary, to talk to the ghost of her mother, and finally, to begin to think. Abigail's patience was her most powerful healing tool, a loving wait that respected the timeline of pain. Alistair acted as a cautious diplomat, moving between the two islands of suffering in his house. He would talk to Olivia through the door, not trying to convince her, but just making sure she knew she wasn't alone. And he would spend hours with Abigail, listening to her talk about the past, about the pain of her choice, helping her process the grief for the daughter who now, paradoxically, seemed more real and more lost than ever. In that process, he was healing not just them, but himself, learning to deal with loss through empathy, not escape. The change came on the fourth day. Olivia left. Her room. She was pale, and her eyes were swollen, but the fury on her face had been replaced by a thoughtful exhaustion. She didn't say a word to anyone. She went down the stairs, past Alistair and Abigail, who were in the living room, and walked straight to the studio. Abigail's heart stopped for a moment, fearing the girl would destroy the canvas, the only symbol of her progress. But Olivia didn't. She stood in front of the easel and looked at the small blue mark she had made days before. Then, with a calm that mirrored Abigail's, she picked up a paintbrush, dipped it in a vibrant yellow, and painted a small dot of light next to the blue stroke. It wasn't a painting. It wasn't a work of art. It was a message. The blue of her sadness now had, beside it, the yellow of hope. It was her way of saying, without words, that she was willing to try, that she was willing to let a little light into her darkness. It was the fragile beginning of her acceptance, the first step toward a forgiveness. She still didn't know how to give. Later that same day, Abigail was in the garden, sitting in her wheelchair, watching the sunset. Olivia approached and, without a word, sat on the bench beside her. There were no apologies, no grand speeches, just silence. They sat there together, grandmother and granddaughter, two strangers united by blood and pain, watching the day die. And in that shared silence, the war finally ended. The peace that settled was not the peace of before, based on secrets, but a new, more fragile and infinitely more honest peace. The journey of healing would be long and full of relapses. They both knew that. Rebuilding trust, redefining their roles, learning to be a family from such a seismic truth would take time. But for the first time, all the pieces were on the table. There were no more secrets, no more lies. There was only the pain, the love, and the choice to face the future together. Alistair, watching them from the window, felt a wave of hope. His family was broken, yes, but he finally believed with all his heart that they could be mended. Abigail looked at Olivia's profile, so much like Stella's, and felt a peace she hadn't experienced in 40 years. The promise she had made to herself to protect her daughter's daughter was just beginning to be fulfilled. The pain of having lost Stella would never disappear, but now, beside Olivia, the grief gained a new meaning. It was no longer just about absence, but also about presence, about the legacy of love that lived on in this strong, resilient girl. Alistair joined them on the bench. He didn't sit between them, but next to Olivia, completing the circle. He put an arm around his daughter's shoulders and smiled at Abigail. "It's a beautiful sunset," he said. It was a simple sentence, but laden with meaning. The sun was setting on a chapter of pain and secrets in their lives, and he was there, present, to ensure they would see the sunrise together the next day, no matter how uncertain the new day might seem. Olivia, feeling the weight of her father's arm, didn't pull away. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax, to accept that gesture of affection. Her anger, her constant companion for a year, had quieted. In its place, there was a melancholy but also a curiosity. Curiosity about the woman sitting beside her, the grandmother who was a stranger, the guardian of half of her history. The journey to know her and to know herself was just beginning. And for the first time, it didn't scare her. Abigail felt the warmth of the moment, the fragile truce that had been established. She had taken a risk, had put her heart on the line, and had almost lost everything. But as she looked at her granddaughter and the man who loved her daughter, she knew she had made the right choice. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone in her grief. They were now three loners, united by the same loss and the same hope, ready to try, together, to transform the ruins of their past into a new and unlikely home. Alistair knew the path to redemption was long. He had betrayed his daughter's trust and invaded Abigail's privacy. But unlike before, he would not run from the difficulty. He was willing to do the work, to have the hard conversations, to be patient, to learn to love in a way that wasn't controlling or possessive. The transformation of his family depended on his own transformation, and he was finally ready to begin, inspired by the silent strength of the woman who had entered his life to be a nanny and had become his teacher. Night fell, wrapping the garden in a soft darkness. But for the first time, the darkness in the Finch mansion didn't feel threatening. It was a calm, starry darkness, a space for silence, for reflection, and for the promise of a new dawn. The three of them remained seated together for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts, but united by a new and unbreakable line of connection. The war for Olivia's soul was over, and the armistice had the bittersweet taste of truth. The days that followed the truce in the garden were marked by a strange delicacy. The healing didn't begin with grand conversations or apologies, but with silent gestures. Stella's art studio, once a place of confrontation, became the sanctuary of their reconstruction. Abigail would spend her afternoons there, simply sitting, reading, creating an atmosphere of peace and permission. Olivia, drawn like a magnet, began to spend time in the room, initially in a hostile silence, which slowly transformed into a quiet curiosity, observing the grandmother she barely knew. The first real bridge was built with paint. Olivia began to paint again, and her canvases were a reflection of her soul, chaotic, dark, full of a furious beauty. Abigail never criticized. She would just sit beside her and offer technical advice, her teacher's voice gently re-emerging. If you add a little white here, you can create a point of light, even in the deepest darkness. She wasn't just teaching about painting, she was teaching about hope. She was giving Olivia the tools to find the light in her own darkness. Alistair, seeing this interaction, felt like a stranger, but one who wished to belong. One day, he entered the studio, awkward and uncertain. "I don't know how to do this," he said, looking at the canvases. Olivia, in a gesture of peace he would never forget, held out a paintbrush to him. "Nobody does, Dad. We just try." And so the billionaire, the nanny, and the rebellious teenager began to spend their afternoons painting together. They didn't talk about the past. They just mixed colors, cleaned brushes, and in the silence of shared creation, their new, unlikely family began to take shape. A year later, the mansion was different. The walls, once dominated by the perfect and melancholy portraits of Stella, now shared space with Olivia's vibrant and emotional canvases. The house was no longer just a shrine to the past, but a living gallery that celebrated both memory and the present. Grief still existed, but it was no longer the master of the house. It had been integrated into life, transformed from a heavy shadow into one more color in the family's palette, one that gave depth and meaning to all the others. On Stella's birthday, they didn't go to the cemetery. Instead, they unveiled the centerpiece of the studio, a large triptych they had painted together. The left panel was a serene landscape in Stella's classic style, which Abigail helped her recreate from old sketches. The right was an explosion of abstract colors, Olivia's signature, and in the center, uniting the two, was a portrait of Olivia, painted by Alistair, the girl's gaze no longer defiant, but full of a new, calm wisdom. It was the story of their lineage, told in paint. The love between Alistair and Abigail settled into a place of deep, quiet companionship. It wasn't a romantic passion, but something perhaps rarer and stronger. It was a partnership forged in shared grief, in the common purpose of caring for Olivia and in a mutual admiration for their journeys. They were the guardians of Stella's memory and the architects of her granddaughter's future. They became, in the truest sense of the word, family, proving that the strongest bonds are not always defined by wedding rings, but by silent promises and a shared purpose. The story of the Finch family became a silent lesson about the complex and unexpected forms that love and healing can take. They learned that a family is not defined by titles like mother or grandmother, but by presence, patience, and the courage to stay, even when the pain seems unbearable. Abigail, the grandmother who arrived as a stranger, taught a father and a daughter that grief doesn't have to be an end point. It can be a blank canvas, waiting for them together to find the courage to paint a new and beautiful future over the scars of the past. A story that shows us that family can be found in the most unexpected places. What did you think of the way they healed? Leave your opinion in the comments, like the video if this ending moved you, and subscribe so you don't miss the new stories we prepare for you every day.